Aloha, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our Hawaii Economic Association online webinar. My name is Leslie Gabrielle Harvey of the Hawaii Business Consultancy and of the Hawaii Economic Association. Last month, we had our annual conference, a 2-half-day discussion on finding Hawaii's new economic equilibrium given the current economic climate. We were thrilled that so many of you joined us, beating all of our previous conference attendance records. Mahalo to those who tuned in and to our nearly 200 2021 members. If you are interested in learning more about HEA membership, only $40 for the year to support economic education, discussion, and these types of events, we'll be sending you more information after this webinar. And please don't miss next month's highly anticipated panel, our final conference follow-on webinar, the Economic Forecast Panel. Today, we bring you a conference follow-on webinar looking more closely at diversification as a path towards economic resiliency in Hawaii. Many of our members joined today's webinar for free as a perk of membership. Mahalo for joining us, and thank you to those non-members who've purchased $5 Q&A access and those who are joining us via Facebook live stream. As the virtual platform becomes more commonplace, it's likely that we will continue to make adjustments in the future. We appreciate your grace and willingness in navigating these adjustments with us. I want to give a special thank you to those who donated to our student fund and general donation fund. As a result of your generosity throughout the year, we were able to provide significantly more to our scholarship recipients, as well as providing a nominal gift to many more economic students. Your generous contribution allows us to continue to provide these events without operating at a loss and supporting student access to events and student support, as well as providing student scholarships. We're glad to be delivering economic education, information, and resources. We will be exploring resiliency in Hawaii, featuring Colbert Matsumoto, Evan Gates, and moderated by our very own Seth Colby. Following each presentation, we will have a Q&A session. We encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions. Feel free to send, comment, and upvote questions at any time. Seth will solicit questions as time permits, prioritizing questions with a significant amount of upvotes. At the end of today's webinar, I ask that you take a few moments to let us know how we did. Before you leave, check the chat function for a link to our feedback form. All registrants will receive the link via email as well. And as you can see on your screen, we've also enabled a couple of polls, one at the beginning and one at the end of this presentation. For those of you joining us via Zoom, your submissions are anonymous. The window just pops up automatically, and we ask that you take a few seconds to respond if you have not yet. This feature, again, is limited to those who have joined us via a Q&A access ticket. We will be sure to get the slides to you and a recording of the event next week. If you've managed to join us today without registering and would like that information, please register at heanovember2020.eventbrite.com to automatically receive today's materials. Now to begin, Seth Colby is the Tax Research and Planning Officer for the Hawaii Department of Taxation and our very own Board of Directors. Seth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Do you guys hear me all right? Yeah, perfect. So I want to introduce two esteemed guests. The first one is Evan Gates. He's a graduate of Kamehameha Schools, and he's currently an undergraduate at Harvard studying applied mathematics and economics. And Evan has been helping Colbert write a very interesting paper that I'm going to talk a little bit about after I introduce Colbert. And Colbert Matsumoto is the chairman of Island Holdings, a corporate holding company whose operating subsidiaries include Island Insurance, Atlas Insurance, Tradewind Capital Group. Colbert has had a very long history of really serving the Hawaii community. A couple notable ones is Colbert served as a court-appointed master for the Kamehameha Schools Bishop Estate during the Broken Trust period. He has also led the committee ad hoc committee to save the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, and he's done a number of things. He's been the chairman of the board of trustees for the employees retirement system. So he has a really long history of serving this community and bringing people together, extracting ideas, and aggregating or putting them together in a way that's a more it's easier to digest. And so the way I came to actually know Colbert was about 1.5 years ago through his last paper in his work through the Hawaii Executive Committee. And that is through a paper that he published called Troubled Waters. And Troubled Waters was a paper that brought together a lot of economists, a lot of thinkers, a lot of policymakers, people from the nonprofit all together, and really started to think about what were the problems set, what are some of the large fiscal problems that the state of Hawaii is confronting over the next 20 or 30 years. He brought that together and it had a very significant effect on the dialogue that was occurring. It got picked up by the local press and a lot of people took with it and run with it. So I'll be short so Colbert and Evan can discuss what they're doing, but they're doing something similar this year, but they're looking at the issue of diversification. I had supported them on as they were looking at different things at this issue of diversification, how to diversify the economy of Hawaii. And it was really interesting to me to see their evolution of how they went around thinking this problem. Because I think a lot of people probably on this call get very frustrated with Hawaii's economy and its overall reliance on tourism, right? And so we have this visual feeling that we want to get away from tourism. And I think Colbert and Evan were on a similar trajectory, and as they learn more, they've kind of diverged and evolved. And so I really look forward to hearing what they have to say as people who have really gone through the process of thinking about the diversification of Hawaii's economy. So without further ado, I will pass it on over to our two esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Seth. Aloha. My name is Colbert Matsumoto, and I'm the co-chair of the Government and Civic Affairs Committee of the Hawaii Executive Collaborative. And I'd like to thank the Hawaii Economic Association for giving us this opportunity to present preliminary findings of our report, which will be published later this year. Last year, the Hawaii Executive Conference commissioned a study on Hawaii's unfunded liabilities and produced a report that Seth referred to, entitled Troubled Waters, that identified over $88 billion in unfunded liabilities facing the state and the counties. This year, under the auspices of the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, we decided to examine the calls for diversifying Hawaii's economy as a policy objective. Since the goal of economic diversification is not new and has been advocated for decades, we decided to examine Hawaii's history of past efforts to reach that goal by studying those initiatives. We identified over 35 past initiatives since statehood by both government and the private sector aimed at diversifying Hawaii's economy. We interviewed over 40 experts familiar with those efforts. This included many individuals directly involved with planning and implementing the initiatives. For the most part, those past diversification efforts can all be classified as failures. Some were quite catastrophic from the standpoint of the economic costs associated with the initiative. One glaring example is the high-tech research tax credit, commonly referred to as Act 221, that cost the state $1.7 billion in lost tax revenues with no enduring benefit. Nonetheless, we found useful lessons from that history of failed initiatives. Above all, we found that economic policy goals require thoughtful planning and long-term vision. Without careful database development of plans and policies, the ad hoc decision-making that was the genesis for many of the diversification initiatives were flawed from inception. It is increasingly apparent that in post-pandemic Hawaii, we will face a tremendous strain of public resources that will last for many years. Budget shortfalls will be greater and last longer than before. The state's Council on Revenues forecast of general fund revenues pre-pandemic in January, and as compared to currently, forecasts a $10 billion shortfall in general fund revenue. Now, more than ever, it is critical that we set the right goals for how our limited public resources are going to be utilized in the decade ahead. We need to exercise care in assessing and planning our economic future with a long-term perspective firmly in hand and not based on short-term cyclical events or reactionary political goals. Evan?
Thanks, Colbert. Good morning, everyone. As everyone said, my name is Evan Gates, and I've served as the principal researcher for this project, and it's been over 5 months now, so we're really excited to share some of our preliminary findings with you all. So in evaluating if Hawaii really needs to affirmatively diversify our economy, but we studied, whether our economy really is over-reliant on the visitor industry. And so the first question we needed to answer was just, how diverse is Hawaii's economy? DBED and UHERO have been doing some work on this question for a while, and our analysis of their research and our own found a few things. First, the tourism sector today makes up much less of total state GDP than it did in the past. We're just demonstrably more diversified away from tourism than in the past. And while the neighbor islands do have more dependence on tourism than, say, Oahu, it has improved significantly since its past dependence on plantation agriculture. Second, one of the most relevant empirical-based metrics of how diverse an economy is called the entropy index. And over the past 20 years, Hawaii has consistently been improving on its diversity score. And you can also see on this graph that the level of economic diversity tends to follow how well the general economy is doing. And we found that general economic growth leads to greater diversification, not the other way around. And third, we have to be realistic as to how diversified Hawaii could truly be. I mean, we live in a small island community, and our population is distributed across 6 major islands. We have serious constraints on population, on size, on geographical proximity, and on resources unlike most other places in the world. And other small island economies similarly struggle with these things, but we're actually doing better than most of them. But despite all of this, public perception and the economic data do not really match. Many still think that Hawaii is doing bad at diversification, and they relentlessly blame tourism for all of our problems. We think this is because of 2 main reasons. First, the abrupt shutdown of the visitor industry in March coincided with a general closure of all areas of economic activity. But the tourism part of Oahu is heavily concentrated in one geographical area, Waikiki. So it's a very visible shutdown, but the shutdown in other parts of the economy is distributed across the entire state. So it's much less visible. Understandably then, people have laid all the problems at the foot of the tourism shutdown, but tourism doesn't even make up close to half of our economy. Tourism simply is not responsible for all of our problems right now, or even most. And 2, all of this has occurred on the tailwinds of public frustration over the explosion in numbers of visitors in recent years. We've had complaints for years over ineffective regulation of accommodations in neighborhoods, over the failure to improve infrastructure in response to the increase in visitors, and over a general lack of any management of tourism growth and its impact on our resources. And without any sense of proper management, it's no reason that social unrest and a lack of community alignment consistently plague the topic of tourism. Recently, these factors have combined to amplify the calls for diversifying Hawaii's economy away from tourism. But the fundamental question that many seem to be missing from all of this is simply to ask, why diversify in the first place? It seems like many have taken diversification as a God-given, divinely inspired economic policy that's self-evidently desirable. And even we, at the beginning of our research, took this as a given in some ways. As Seth mentioned earlier, we were on the diversification train. We were searching for the answer on how to diversify, like many in the public are right now. But as we researched more, our research found an abundance of evidence that began to dissuade us and change our path. For instance, we found that advocacy groups often mask their political goals under this veil of diversification because it's a popular buzzword in our community. And this isn't unique to any political group or ideology, but what it does is warp an understanding of what should be a question of economics. We need to be straightforward and crystal clear in defining the economic challenges that we face. Our biggest finding was that diversification can be best understood in the same way that people understand portfolio theory when they're investing. There are two main aspects of the economy, or two main parts of the equation. First, there's economic growth, the return measured by GDP, wage growth, employment, the presence of poverty or lack thereof. The other part of the equation is risk, which we measure by volatility, or the severity and frequency of the fluctuations and ups and downs of the economy. A higher risk economy has harsher ups and downs. And while that volatility can never be eliminated, it can be minimized. Good practice is to balance these two elements, and there's almost always a trade-off between the two. A low risk economy typically has lower growth, and a high growth economy typically has higher risk. We all seem to agree that something is wrong with our economy, but the proper question for Hawaii should be, are we suffering from a risk problem or a growth problem? I mean, which one is it? Does Hawaii have too much risk or too little growth? Well, we analyzed this exact question, and of how volatile and risky the economy of Hawaii is, and found that Hawaii has an incredibly low risk economy. We took the standard deviation, which measures how volatile something is, of wages, of GDP, of employment in Hawaii over decades of data. And we rank better than almost any state in the country on how low risk we are. While we do have economic shocks like everywhere else in the world, and like we're having right now, Hawaii on average has less volatile ups and downs in its economy. And we cannot base long-term economic policy on this single black swan event of COVID. Instead, good economic policy bases its goals on the broader tendencies of an economy over time. And over time, Hawaii is not a risky economy. On the other hand, Hawaii has had meager economic growth for at least the past 40 years. Hawaii's state GDP did experience a consistent high rate of growth from statehood until the 80s, when it averaged around 4.9%. But changes in policies and priorities resulted in a slowdown of that growth to less than half of what it was before. And this deterioration in our rate of growth is continuing to this day. In 2019, for example, we ended a year in which Hawaii experienced record numbers of visitors, but yet our GDP grew by only 1% as compared to the national average of 2.3%. It's this lack of growth that is causing much of Hawaii's economic hardships. Pre-COVID, Hawaii's problems included low wages, a high cost of living, a lack of affordable housing, and more. And moreover, the state was facing increasing budgetary issues and consistently took the easy, uncreative way out of just raising taxes again and again. These are not risk problems. They're a result of a lack of growth that's well distributed across income classes. Growth increases wages, it increases the number of jobs, and it increases the capacity of our economy. So which is the bigger problem? Is it the fact that we have incredibly low risk, but not zero? Or is it the fact that the number of ALICE households are continually rising in Hawaii? In other words, is it the fact that we aren't the best in the nation in terms of low risk? Or is it that hundreds of thousands of households have for years been one accident away from poverty or losing their housing or healthcare? And just for context, ALICE households are asset limited, income constrained, employed households. And this means they don't appear on typical metrics like poverty or unemployment. But these households have consistently increased in number and been left behind as a result of a lack of meaningful growth in Hawaii. We have to understand that diversification is not an end in itself. It's a tool with a specific purpose, and that purpose is risk mitigation. By definition, like in investing, diversification seeks to reduce risk in a portfolio by decreasing unsystematic risk. In other words, diversification seeks to buoy and hold up the economy by having multiple legs on our chair so we don't fall over. Diversification is not an economic growth strategy. It's a risk management strategy. And a strategy of diversification, or calls for diversification, insinuate that what we need to be worrying about in Hawaii is risk. And that simply is not the case when we look at the data.
As Evan indicates, diversification should be viewed as just one part of a much larger conversation around economic resiliency. The focus needs to be on identifying and addressing the vulnerabilities within our economy. Our research informed us that Hawaii needs to change the public debate from a mistaken goal of diversifying away from tourism toward building a resilient economy. Taking steps towards economic resilience offers significantly more potential for economic growth and social stability, which is ultimately what we seek as a community. But what is a resilient economy? It's an economy that can anticipate, adapt to, and leverage changing conditions to its advantage. It is characterized by good governance, market efficiency, macroeconomic stability, and social cohesion. A resilient economy offers opportunities to individuals to pursue personal growth and prosperity. It fosters stable growth that enhances the quality of life and promotes a healthier community. To achieve economic resilience, we need certain fundamental conditions in place to support economic growth. Like cultivating a crop, a seed planted without the right conditions, like good soil, sunshine, and water, will not germinate and grow. Likewise, Hawaii needs to establish the right conditions for our economy to prosper. The conditions we need are: 1, a willingness to change; 2, the ability to act in a timely manner; 3, investment in key infrastructure; 4, developing a skilled and talented workforce; and 5, community alignment. So how do we get there? Above all, we need to be willing to embrace change. A society that's not willing to change is doomed to collapse. The landscape of the United States, and even Hawaii, has dozens of once visible, vibrant communities that are now ghost towns or shadows of their past glory because of their failure to change. Is Hawaii willing and ready to change? Our resistance to change is structurally embedded in law and administrative processes that have been enacted to create barriers to economic activity. Since the 1970s, the number of laws enacted to protect the status quo grew to create a minefield of lengthy and costly reviews and approvals. It was no surprise that repeatedly our research revealed that those legal barriers have reputationally established Hawaii as a regulatory black hole. Regulations often target big real estate developers, but even the average homeowner was not spared from that regulatory burden, as was demonstrated with Hawaii's historic preservation law. Since 1976, that law required any building 50 years or older to be considered a historic property. This included single-family residences and townhouses. Any modification that required a building permit was subject to review and prior approval by the State Historic Preservation Division, or SHPD. This led to lengthy administrative delays in processing ordinary residential building permits due to the requirement that a chronically understaffed and inefficiently managed SHPD review and approve each permit application. Thousands of residential building permits seeking to improve and modify existing homes were annually subjected to SHPD's review process. It took 40 years of criticism about the wasteful delays and burdensome processing under SHPD and over the objections of the EA administration before the legislature finally amended the law to exempt most residential properties from its application. That example just stands as one of many laws enacted over the years with the expressed intent to impede change by subjecting development proposals to burdensome and time-consuming review processes. Despite the economic inertia it caused, it took decades to spare homeowners from this added layer of red tape. Public infrastructure is a key magnet for attracting private investment capital to an economy. Has Hawaii been making strategic long-term investments in new infrastructure? It's bad enough that the state chronically mismanages maintenance and existing public infrastructure. But the failure to make appropriate long-term infrastructure investments in anticipation of global trends and economic opportunities reflects a lack of vision and commitment to the future by our leaders. One glaring example is the failure to develop a shared access fiber optic cable landing site that would promote linking Hawaii to trans-Pacific cable projects. In 2007, the Hawaii Broadband Task Force was created to examine what was required for Hawaii to enable the development of advanced telecommunications technology. At that time, the legislature recognized the future economic vitality of Hawaii would be dependent upon its connectivity with the rest of the world. In its final report, the task force proposed an aggressive and forward-looking vision that would position Hawaii for global competitiveness. The goal was to establish Hawaii as a telecommunications hub that had the capacity to develop next-generation applications, such as AI, machine learning, augmented reality, data analytics, blockchain, and real-time predictive systems. But despite the task force's recommendation that the state lead the development of a shared access cable landing site, that project remains unrealized 13 years later. Funds previously appropriated by the legislature for its development lapsed, and subsequent efforts to appropriate funds have faltered in the perennial competition for CIP dollars at the legislature. Meanwhile, Hawaii continues to be bypassed by many fiber optic cable installations between Asia and North America. The pace of progress, if not timely, can result in our falling behind the rest of the world. Is Hawaii prepared to act in a timely manner? One weakness we face in Hawaii is our high tolerance for delays, especially in government. The culture of the bureaucracy is notoriously unmotivated by timeliness of action. One stark example of this is the Hawaii Community Development Authority, HCDA, formerly known as the Kaka'ako Development Authority, which was created in 1976 as a redevelopment agency dedicated to urban renewal. After almost 50 years, the redevelopment of Kaka'ako as envisioned by the sponsors of the enabling legislation remain a distant dream. Less than 1/3 of the 600 acres under its jurisdiction have been redeveloped. The irony is that when the state hijacked Kaka'ako from the control of the city and county of Honolulu, it criticized the city government as incapable or inadequate in facilitating timely redevelopment and renewal to meet community redevelopment needs. A striking contrast is the island state of Singapore, which established its Urban Redevelopment Authority at the same time as HCDA. The transformation of Singapore over that same period of time, along with the improvement of the quality of life for its residents, stands as a stark contrast to our own experience. But there is no process for measuring timely performance and accountability of the agency entrusted with this economic development initiative. Rather than shine a light on HCDA's half-century of failing to achieve the vision of its founders, over the years, the legislature has rewarded HCDA with increasingly larger areas of Oahu being placed under its jurisdiction and further displacing the city and county's authority.
A skilled and talented workforce is the main input to a resilient economy. Is Hawaii preparing the workforce needed to strengthen our economic capacity? Well, absent well-trained workers that have skills that are in demand, businesses cannot innovate or stay relevant so that the economy can grow. This can force businesses to have to hire people from outside of the state or outsource the work beyond Hawaii's borders. Moreover, this has spillover because some of those who are well trained must leave the state to go elsewhere where their skills will be valued and utilized. Our public education system has consistently failed many of its students. And while the public may disagree over what precisely is causing this, it's clear that Hawaii is not equipping its future workforce with the skills it needs. Test scores have been meager for a long time, and higher quality private education is out of reach for most families. Teachers and administrators work really hard, and they usually have the best of intentions. But the structure of the public education system has proven to not be conducive to success. This one-size-fits-all top-down structure of the DOE simply has not worked. The University of Hawaii is another key economic resource. A university produces much of the skilled workforce for a region, and a vibrant university incentivizes businesses to invest in the surrounding area because they can benefit from the steady flow of talent and innovation. The University of Hawaii has made important economic contributions to Hawaii through its investments in the marine science and astronomy departments, but it continues to face typical bureaucratic issues that hold back its potential for achieving economic resilience. Siloing in departments and a lack of cooperation and vision have entrenched many ineffective or outdated practices. The legislature itself has proven to be a barrier to success for the university. It regularly undermines the governance structure of the University of Hawaii by using its budgetary power to micromanage, even down to the program level. Elements within the university often directly lobby the legislature to successfully promote their own agenda against the plans of university leadership. Research, it's one of the main drivers of economic growth. Research provides new knowledge, new methods, and new technologies to allow businesses to increase productivity. But despite the university's efforts to foster research activities, the legislature frequently denies funding for research projects that cannot 100% guarantee a return. And research is thus underfunded and underutilized at the university. Preparing our citizens for the workforce requires an overhaul of the public education and university system and a rethinking of the role of the legislature and government in the administration of public education. We pride ourselves in Hawaii for our aloha spirit and the value of lokahi. And as an island community, we recognize the importance of social cohesion to enable us to live together harmoniously. But are we building that community alignment so we can enjoy social cohesion? This is one of the real cruxes of economic resilience. If people cannot trust each other and seek cooperation and collaboration above personal interests, then economic resilience just isn't achievable. Community alignment means having that trust and openness within the community. As the vast swath of protests of economic projects over the past few years have demonstrated, the processes for regulatory approval are failing to engender public trust and confidence. Government agencies need to act in a transparent and timely manner to give both applicants and affected parties a credible process for approvals. Moreover, public officials need to restore public confidence in its regulatory processes by maintaining the integrity of those processes through appropriate enforcement of final decisions. The private sector is not the enemy of the people, yet many of our laws reflect a distrust of businesses by attempting to regulate their activities to the point of undermining the feasibility of economic initiatives. For example, up until 1984, Hawaii was 100% self-sufficient in dairy. But 30 years later, almost 90% of Hawaii's dairy products were shipped here across the Pacific. Starting in 2013, the Ulupono Initiative sought to develop a grass-fed dairy farm with 700 cows on Kauai, with the encouragement of public officials. But over time, neighborhood groups mobilized against the project, many of them with misleading, flawed, or even outright false studies that proclaimed catastrophic effects of this dairy farm. And as the opposition mounted, government support waffled despite professed food self-sufficiency goals. And Ulupono was forced to terminate its efforts after investing around $17.5 million into the project. This was a clear case, among many others, where government processes failed to reconcile broader public policy objectives with local fears and misunderstanding. The failure of public leaders to intervene is a big part of the problem. Governor Ige himself had repeatedly pronounced his administration's goal of attaining food self-sufficiency in Hawaii by 2020. But despite this, his administration failed to demonstrate any meaningful support in Ulupono's costly struggle to contribute that goal. Public leaders have a responsibility to cultivate community alignment. They're entrusted with the leadership of our state, and they have to use those roles to bring divergent parties together, to reconcile differences and the long-term interests of the larger community. While some politicians will promote their own political interests by pandering to certain vocal, small special interest groups, we need more leaders with the courage to advocate effectively for the greater good of our state and its people.
Sorry. The process for developing a resilient economy will take time. It cannot be achieved in 2 or 3 years, but must be targeted over the course of at least a decade. That is why the most critical foundation for achieving economic resilience is good governance. We need capable leadership with strategic vision and the ability to develop long-range plans for achieving that vision. We must rethink governance in Hawaii. The leadership of our Economic Development Agency should not be based on political patronage to provide jobs for political cronies. It should be entrusted to visionary leaders with a macroeconomic perspective and an understanding of finance and business. We must be willing to invest in a robust planning function. In the early years after statehood, Hawaii emphasized the importance of long-term planning. At one time, Hawaii was touted as having the best government and private sector planning in the country during the 60s and the 70s. There's no coincidence that during this period of planning, that it coincided with the best period of economic growth in the state's history. Resiliency at its core is about anticipating and planning for future events. We may not always know what is about to come, but if we create a governance structure that is guided by long-term planning, that reflects the values we hope to maintain across time, we will be better prepared to adapt and innovate in the face of change. Many of us in the private sector have shirked our responsibility by focusing principally on our own corporate interests and not enough on the collective good of our community. We complain about the poor performance of our elected officials, but fail to challenge them to do better. We ourselves need to provide bolder and courageous leadership in engaging with the public officials entrusted with governing our state by urging them to pursue the right priorities. Together, we must do a better job of educating the broader community about the importance of maintaining a balance between economic growth and community values in order to maintain social stability. The two are symbiotically linked and cannot be achieved without mutual accommodation. With a community-wide commitment to a shared vision of Hawaii's future, we can achieve economic resilience. And on that note, that concludes our presentation. And Evan and I thank you for spending your time to sit in and listen. We'd be happy to entertain any questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Colbert and Evan. That was a great presentation and definitely gives a lot of us to think about. And I really do like your idea. I mean, I'm gonna say, if I could like paraphrase your presentation, is that like really what we need is economic growth, and the biggest barrier to economic growth is good governance that facilitates change in a way that's acceptable to the community. And so, I mean, everybody in, if I'm not correct in saying that, please let me know, but I think that it, however, everybody, I bet, watching this would agree to your final suggestions. Like everybody wants growth, and everybody wants it to include community values, right? The problem is, you know, when it's, I want growth and everything until my neighbor updates his house and does something that I don't like, or, you know, in the case of the dairy farm, it's the neighbors who came and speak out. So one of the you know, the really common problems with all of this, right, and it's been identified in the economics literature for a long time, is the gains are distributed and the losses are very narrowly felt, right? And so whether it's Kahuku Farms, where, you know, there's a handful of the local communities that would feel that there is. So do you have any, or the local community feels like that they would take all the costs of that, whereas the, you know, the benefits of solar or wind power would be distributed through the whole entire state? So do you guys have any specific ideas, as somebody who's worked so long in Hawaii and who's really managed a lot of change, in fact, Colbert, on how you create these systems of governance that where we really minimize these veto points all over the place?
Yeah, well, you know, unfortunately, you know, some of the public issues that have been quite contentious, it's hard to satisfy everybody. But again, that's why, you know, there has to be a focus on what is really the greater long-term good of the community at large. And that's where, you know, I think public leadership is really important in terms of helping better define that and painting the vision of what is it that we're trying to ultimately achieve, even though some of the steps that we have to take along the way are going to be disruptive and inconvenience some people, because, you know, there's a longer term benefit to be achieved. I mean, you look at just Hawaii's current infrastructure. You know, when a lot of it was built, it wasn't as though people, that they weren't controversial. Things that we take for granted, you know, like take the H1. When it was built back in the 50s or 60s, I mean, dozens of people were displaced from their homes that were located along the route of the freeway. But if we didn't have the freeway, can you imagine what life would be like in Honolulu today? I mean, you know, these are the kinds of trade-offs that, you know, public leadership, I think, plays an important role in making sure that they understand and communicate it effectively to the broader community, so that the community can understand why is it that they're taking the steps that they're taking.
Great. You know, one of my favorite slides that you guys had is the Singapore one. However, you know, of like developed Singapore 50 years later versus agricultural Singapore, I think one of the issues is a lot of people would prefer the more agricultural version for Hawaii. So that's one of the big question marks. We have several questions from the audience, and they're being upvoted. So I really encourage everybody, if they haven't and they really want to see a question answered, to upvote that. But the top one we have is more of a technical question. Maybe Evan, this is for you. Is how is the tourism share of the economy calculated? Was it just resorts and tours, accommodations, or did that include retail and restaurants?
Yeah, so that number is not our own. That actually comes from Dr. Eugene Tian, and that is not just resorts and accommodations. It does include indirect spending across industries. So, you know, tourists come here and spend money on the hotels, and those workers make money and spend it in the rest of the economy. It does include, it does not just include the immediate tourism industry. If we were to do that, it would be even smaller. But of course, when you include that, you get the full scope of tourism's reach. And what, like the numbers showed, it's around 16% for 2019. So, and not only that, if you remember that the next slide we showed was the entropy of index. That was a totally different way of measuring it. And both of those came to the same conclusion, that we are becoming more diverse over time. So different methodologies are coming to the same conclusion.
Great. Another question from Paul Brubaker, which is, how do we, in Colbert, you mentioned it, but I'm trying to pin you, both of you guys, down to make it interesting, is how do we, with this overall message, how do we engage the, the decision makers, the policy makers? How would we really create this governance structure that you're talking about?
Well, that's why, I indicated that, I think that community leaders need to basically, engage with, our political leaders and help walk them through in terms of, what our concerns are and what we think are kind of the steps that are needed to be taken to address the concerns. The problem though is that, some of these issues, that we identified aren't new. They've been talked about for decades. But again, we need some people in leadership positions that have the courage to basically take a stand and say that, look, it's not working. We're not getting to where we need to be. We have a terrible affordable housing problem that we've complained about for literally, in the last 2 decades. But, what progress have we made? It's reached a point where people are leaving our state because they just have given up. And, that's intolerable. And so again, if we are afraid of taking some bolder steps and disrupting the status quo, we're not going to fix the problems. We got to be willing to take some tougher positions and make some serious change.
Do you think that the high capital intensive projects that are very visible, is that the way to go? Or is it better to do really small, non-visible projects under the radar the whole time?
Well, it depends on the nature of the project.
Mm-hmm.
You take like the example that I used on the neutral landing site for broad trans-Pacific cables. That's not a really huge capital investment, but the potential leverage that the state would be able to benefit from the private investment that is put into, laying cables across the Pacific could be tremendous, because if they choose to, stop off in Hawaii because they have an easy way to connect, that opens up, our broadband capacity tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
And without that, it's like not having the H1 freeway. If you don't have the mode to basically transmit, large amounts of data across the world, you're not going to be a player in the digital economy in the future.
Good. And so just with this types of planning, so on one hand, we're trying to get more people involved in the planning process. On the other hand, we're trying to speed up planning and make the decisions get done. So is the answer really to incorporate more people at the beginning of the project? Because it seems like here with the planning process, like whether it's Kaka'ako or all these different places, the more planning we do, the slower things seem to get.
One of the problems that is a legacy, I think, of the downturn in our economy back in the 90s, is that up until then, we had a pretty robust planning function within government. In the 90s, after the Japanese bubble period, I think that when the state first faced some major fiscal challenges, a number of budget cuts were made. And I think that that was one of the early cuts, and it has never been really restored since then. And so, you know, that is a big part of the problem, because without a, you know, capable and, you know, informed planning function, we're shooting in the dark. We're making ad hoc decisions. And, you know, and that's why, you know, I mean, so many efforts, you know, will end up failing because, you know, it's not really thought out.
Great. Looking through all these wonderful questions. So just give me a moment. Was there, when you guys are prioritizing growth, so are you moving away from the sector focused? I mean, for example, does tourism offer a spot for growth? What are the areas for growth within the economy, or is that something that you guys don't want to decide? And like, you want other people to decide, but who would be those decision makers?
Yeah, I would say that you know, the state has attempted, you know, some of when we looked at the past initiatives, many of them were publicly initiated initiatives, and you know, for the most part, all of them failed. You know, the state is not good at figuring out what is a viable economic initiative to invest in, and that's why, you know, it's probably better left to the private sector, or at the very least, through some cooperative effort between private sector players and government, because otherwise, you know, left to its own devices, government doesn't understand investment adequately to figure out what's a worthwhile investment.
Right. And to be fair, that is somewhat of the current setup, right? Like if somebody comes with a good investment idea, they show up and then they submit a proposal to the permitting office, and then they're supposed to evaluate. However, my understanding is you think the permitting and the so-called planning process, which is in a lot of ways reactive, could be approved upon in the state. Is that what I'm understanding from you guys?
Oh, definitely. You know, I mean, I think that you know, there have been a lot of people who've been impacted by it. That, and I don't think that they're suggesting that it should be done away with. Yeah, I mean, I think review processes are important because there are community values that are important to us that need to be, you know, protected. But on the other hand, yeah, businesses and investors are entitled to a reasonable time frame in which to expect that their projects and initiatives can move forward. And so that's been a big part of the problem. And so, you know, so the example that we used of Singapore was not intended to, you know, suggest that somehow we want Honolulu to look like Singapore. But yeah, on the other hand, you know, we need to be willing to move faster, because otherwise investments that we make are going to end up being squandered. I mean, Kaka'ako, you know, should be more developed than what it is today. I don't necessarily agree, you know, want to see it developed in the same way that it's been developing in the last 10 years. But on the other hand, I think, and which I don't think is consistent with what the original founders of the Hawaii Community Development Authority envisioned. But, you know, I think that if we can achieve more of what that original goal and objective was sooner, I think Hawaii and, you know, our economy will be a lot better off.
Great. So we're running out of time here. So I'm going to finish up with one question, which was from the audience as well. Is like, if both of you guys have been set up as SARs for resiliency, economic resiliency czars, and you had, what would you guys propose in your first 90 days in office if you had the ears of the legislature, the governor, and all of the mayors?
Well, as I indicated, this is not a short-term effort. This is something that's going to take time because to a certain extent, our thinking is, there's certain biases that have become entrenched. And so it's really going to take a lot of, conversation and trying to reach agreement as to, okay, what are our priorities and how are we going to achieve those?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that in a lot of this, it especially within government, it comes down to mindset. And I think the bureaucratic mindset has very much set in a lot of Hawaii public officials, that just doing what is working or what has worked, even though they're kind of outdated. And so I think it would be really important for, as a czar maybe of Hawaii, to ensure that all of our departments have people within them and people leading them that have extended timeframes of looking long term, rather than kind of looking within a year or two timeframe, which it seems like a lot of these projects are doing. A good analogy I've kind of heard is that we're basically on the economic Titanic in some ways, or at least in some people's views, but not many people want to get in the lifeboat because they're kind of scared of getting a little wet. And so we're kind of, if we continue on this track, things will continue to get worse. And so we have to be willing to get on that lifeboat and remove some of our past biases and accept that we want a change and try and get on top of it.
Yeah, and so that's why, I think one of the key things is getting young people like Evan in our community to understand what some of these challenges are. And because, they're the ones that are going to have to roll up their sleeves and tackle those problems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as you guys, so it sounds like mindset is a big one. Is the mindset through just educating people, or is it actually changing institutional arrangements within here in Hawaii?
Oh, it's both, but it has to start with educating people, because you need to have political support for the kind of changes that I think will have to take place. Well, that's why young people like Evan need to, get a perspective. I think that for Evan himself, I think in working on this research project, he got a great lesson in Hawaii's history, economic history. And I think that, it's affected his perspective on, the direction that the state needs to take going forward. So we need a lot of other people like him to, also take stock of that history and, act upon it.
All right, you got your mandate, Evan. You're gonna, in 10 years, you're all expected to form a cabal, the cabal of economic progress with you and your peers. So I think we have the mandate. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I think it was really instructive in a lot of ways. Your process, you came up with some outstanding ideas and help refocusing our attention, because I think where we focus, like you guys are saying, where we focus our attention is where we are going to produce results, right? And if we just keep looking at only our problems and what's not there, we're never going to be able to really focus our creativity on where we want to move things in the right direction. So thank you so much. I will pass it back to Leslie, who will have some follow-up comments for everybody else.
Thank you very much, Seth. And thank you so much, Evan and Colbert, for that great discussion today, particularly the unique approach to considering diversification and economic growth. Looking forward to seeing that report here. And thank you, attendees. We had a lot of great questions. Sorry that we didn't get to everything, but it does show me the engagement and then that this topic has been of interest to everybody. So perhaps we'll circle back once that report is released. Attendees, please take some time to provide your thoughts on the event. via the feedback form here on your screen. You have the link tinyurl.com/HEA November feedback. It shouldn't take you more than 5 or 10 minutes to complete, but we do read through those and look forward to hearing from you. If you registered, you will also receive this link by email, and the slides, as well as a recording of the event once those are available, anticipated to be next week. Just a reminder, we are an all-volunteer board with the help from our amazing intern, Sierra, but please be patient. We'll get you the materials just as soon as we can. And if you have not yet registered, you will not receive those. So please do register by the end of the day. Registration will close thereafter. And thank you very much for joining us today. A special thank you to our intern, Sierra Brewer, our VP of Programs, Reen Kamita, and our VP of Marketing and Membership, Paul Migliorato, for your work every month on our HEA events. And thank you, returning attendees and those attendees who are joining us for the first time. Be sure to find @Hawaii Economic Association on Facebook. By sharing our event flyers, you support our mission of promoting economic awareness. Stay tuned for more activity on Facebook. We do hope that you'll consider regular attendance at our monthly events. Save the date for our economic forecast panel on December 3rd from 12 to 1 p.m. Registration information will be going out soon. We strive to make our events relevant and beneficial to Hawaii's diverse business community by tackling topics that are pertinent and breaking them down to make them accessible to a broad audience. We hope that you found this to be the case today, and we look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much again for your time and attention, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Mahalo.